My name is Mary Waller. I live in DeLand, Florida. We're taping this at the DeLand house on June 17th, 2015. I was born in Branford, Florida on the Suwannee River, and my grandfather was a captain of a steamship on the river, so the river was very important to us when we were young. We learned to swim in the river, went to the high school there, all the schools all together. We were the only school in the county that had a band. I grew up during the Depression. In 1929 and 30, up through 39, they were very poor people, and they used to come from the north looking for work in Florida. And they would stay beside the road, and they had a pot to cook in, but my mother and father always saved whatever food we had left over so that we could take it out to them so they would have something to eat. Then in 1941, we heard on the news on a Sunday afternoon, December 7th, that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. And we knew the United States was going to be getting into the war in Europe and in the Pacific. That meant that all our armed forces were divided, and we were all over the world. When I was in high school, we didn't have boyfriends because they were in Europe or in the Pacific. There were two boys in my class. One of them was 4F because he was cross-eyed, and the other one was his whole family's sole support, so he was 4F too. We used to wait at the post office to get letters from the boys all over the world because that's the only contact we had with them. We got pictures, and I have a pen that I'd like to show you later that one of them sent me. It was from Hitler. He gave these pens to the women in Germany. If they had 10 Aryan children, he rewarded them with a pen. And so I've kept it all these years. When I was in high school, I was a plane spotter in Branford. We would stay out in the park and look for the planes to come over. We had to be able to identify them. I had never seen a telephone before. And I went inside the hotel. My mother never allowed us to go in that hotel. It was dark inside. And I was ringing somebody and talking to somebody in Jacksonville. That was quite a revelation to me because I didn't even know about telephones. I have an armband that I wore to identify myself. Also, I have a flag that my mother flew or hung in the front window of our house. It has 2 stars on it. And that was because I had 2 brothers that were in the armed forces. I went from Branford High School to Orlando, and I went into nurses training. It was 1,096 days of basic training. By the time we got out of basic training, we were nurses and we could handle any situation. I was there for 3 years. My first job was in Live Oak, Florida, at the Suwannee Hospital, and I was a head nurse at night. We had handled everything: the emergency room, typhoid, childbirth, anything that could happen, trauma, surgery, medical. One of the things that I remember distinctly was that men would come in, men particularly, would come in with something they called acute indigestion, and they would die. Some of them were 45 years old. It was a heart attack, but we didn't know it then. We didn't have any treatment for it. We had just begun to get penicillin to take care of extreme infections. All the penicillin and antibiotics went to the armed forces for the wounded people in the hospital. We used to give every 2 hours with a needle this long into the buttocks, and they were like pin cushions. It was a terrible sentence to be sentenced to penicillin. I met Joe Carlton, married him in 1949. And we went to Norfolk. He was in the Navy. He and his brothers-in-law had all served in the service. And I worked in the emergency room at Norfolk General Hospital for a few months until he got out. I remember one time I took him to work and he climbed up on a huge ship in the harbor, and came back, and I got in the car and drove to the hospital, came back to pick him up, and the ship was gone. And they wouldn't tell me where he went or how long he's going to be gone. And I wanted to go to Florida, I can tell you. I wanted to see my mama. It was a long way from home. Then we came back to Florida, lived in Jacksonville. Joe Carlton went to jewelry school there. I had a job at Riverside Hospital as a supervisor on one of the floors. I had 13 patients. It was a marvelous job because you could do everything that the patient needed. You didn't have to hurry around and do a sloppy job, and I had students to work for me. I really enjoyed that. We moved to DeLand in 1952, and one of the main things I remember about moving here was I had no friends. I didn't know anybody. If you had come along and said, "Come home with me," I'd have gone. I needed friends. Joe was working at Duval Jewelry Company, and I was working at Fish Hospital, and just opened, brand new. That was a dream job too, because I could set up all the medications and the procedures and my equipment exactly like I wanted to do. Never happens. You never get to set up a brand new hospital. We moved patients from out at the naval base. We had 7 patients we moved that day by ambulance. And when we got there, we realized we'd forgotten to bring a bedpan. So somebody had to rush back out to the hospital to get a bedpan. There were 5 doctors in DeLand at that time. Dr. West and Dr. Valentine, Dr. Tribble, Dr. Hahn, and Dr. Hutching. Dr. West was our surgeon. Dr. Tribble did surgery too. Then, 1954, I had a baby. She's here today. Her name is Kathy. When Kathy was 2 years old, in the middle of the night, I remember her birthday party because she took her hand and took the cake, smeared it all over her face. And about 2 weeks later, Joe and I were sleeping in bed at 5 o'clock in the morning. And I woke up with somebody with their hand over my face. And when I looked, Joe was beside me, his head was crushed in. Somebody had hit him with a sledgehammer. The man was standing there, and I was screaming so loud until it frightened him. He had a sledgehammer in his hand, and he ran from the house. And Kathy was 2. She could talk real good. And she came in and she said, "Mama, what's the matter with Papa?" And I realized that I had to be sane for her because I was out on my mind there for a while. I know what hysteria is. It's a terrible feeling. They found the man. They caught him within 7 minutes. I picked up the phone and the operator answered, and I said, "Somebody has killed my husband." And within 7 minutes, the DeLand police were there. And they traced his footsteps through the woods, found the sledgehammer, saw where he had stolen a truck from Ralph Townsend. And they caught him driving the truck down South Florida Avenue. They took me to the hospital, and they put Nathaniel Lee, was his name, in front of the car. And they said, "Is this the man?" And I said, "Does he have any blood on him?" And I recognized him, but they used that against me. I felt like it was against me at the trial. They said, and they said, at the trial, I sat like 10 feet from Nathaniel Lee. It was a horrible, horrible experience. And they said, "Do you wear glasses, Miss Carlton?" And I said, "When I read." They said, "Did you have them on? 5 o'clock in the morning, sound asleep?" No. They were able to cast enough doubt. They found Nathaniel Lee guilty, but they recommended mercy. And I felt like he needed to be put to death. About 10 years later, I started to write to people all over the state of Florida, and I said, "Don't let Nathaniel Lee out of prison, I'm afraid. I don't want him to come for us." And I got a letter from Rayford, from the head man, and he said he died 6 years ago. And here I'd been trying to take care of it myself, worrying myself sick about it. And it increased my faith in God, because I knew God could take care of the most serious thing that could happen to me. And he had handled it. I didn't have to handle it. Well, a year and a half later, Kathy and I married Fred Waller, and we had a baby. Her name was Connie. Fred was a workaholic. He worked day and night. He built us a house. It took him 3 years, and he worked on holidays and Sundays, and after midnight, built it all himself. First thing he built was a swimming pool. He was a swimming pool builder, and he wanted us to have a pool to swim in while he was building the house. So we'd go out in the woods down there off of Orange Camp and go swimming. He built 2,500 pools, we estimated. That's a lot of pools. He was the only pool builder in the DeLand area. We used to call it the Waller Training School, because we taught other people how to build pools. And as soon as they got to where they were confident, then they would go and start their own company and build pools themselves. Fred died in 1994 with cancer, pancreatic cancer. I had one husband that died suddenly and one that died slowly. I don't know which is the most painful. In 1970, well, back to 1959, I went back to Stetson University and got my degree. I had a 2-year-old, and she used to go to Ms. Logue's child care place, and I'd say, "Kathy, what did you have for lunch today?" And she'd say, "Giddy." They ate spaghetti a lot. But she loved Ms. Logue, and she was good to her. And I worked my way through Stetson as a nurse in the infirmary. And then in 1971, I had a lot of friends who were nurses, and one LPN came to me and she says, "Mary, why don't you teach us that were grandfathered in, who never had any training?" So I had my first class was LPNs, and it was a revelation to them. They knew to do, and they knew what to do and how to do it, but they didn't know why. And I was able to tell them why we did it a certain way. And then I was asked to do home health care, so I traveled all over Volusia and Flagler County, teaching groups of people how to take care of their invalids at home. I took my equipment with me and did that for a while, and then I started a new class for nurses' aides at DBCC, and I taught many. And then I taught RNs for a while, and one day I went in my boss's office, and on his desk there was an orange book, and it said, "Emergency Medical Technician." I said, "What's that?" He said, "It's a new course that we have to teach. The government has said that we have to teach that course." So he says, "You want to do it?" And I said, "Sure." So that was the 4th new class that I started. And I taught them for quite a while, and then we had paramedics. That course came. So in all, I had 5 different courses that I started at DBCC. I wanted to say, when Joe and I lived in Jacksonville, we saw a TV for the first time. It was in a store window, and we just really wanted one. We finally saved up our money and got a TV, and we would ask people to come over and watch, and the fights were very popular back then, so sometimes our living room would be dark and there'd be people sitting all over the floor watching the fights. And then the other thing that we did was go out to the airport. We were poor, but we went out to the airport to watch the jet planes because they were new. We'd never seen a jet plane before. We watched them take off and land, and that was quite a revelation too. With Fred gone, I volunteered to write for the Branford News about what I remembered as a child, and I did that for 10 years. I have a book that my daughter Connie and I put together with the articles that I wrote about Branford on the Suwannee River, about my relatives. And then that paper went out of business, so I attended a lot of concerts at Stetson because I like music. And one time we were coming home, and my winter guests, who have been with me for 20 years, they said, we're just tearing that concert apart, talking about what we liked, what we didn't like, how they did well or didn't do well. And I said, I could write about that. So I went to the Beacon and talked to Barb Shepherd, and I said, I could write about the concerts. And she said, well, give it a try. I showed her some of the articles I had written for the Branford paper. So she said, let's try it. So I have done that for 10 years, I guess. And earlier this year, I talked to Barb and I said, I'd really like to change that format because I've used all the superlatives I can think about the music at Stetson. It really is wonderful. There's some wonderful artists there. They've been there for 35 years. They do such a good job, but I love that music. So now I'm writing about different people in the land area that I find interesting. I have a lot of friends, and some of them are fascinating. So I've written about 6 or 7 articles now about different people in the community. One time, early in the morning, just before Christmas, Kathy and Connie and their husbands and daughters came to the door, and there was a man with them. They knocked on the door, and I'm half-dressed, you know. I said, wait a minute. I came to the door. Kathy says, put on some clothes, Mother. And when I opened the door, it was the Chamber of Commerce. No, that's not right. It was a Kiwanis Club. They said I was a parade marshal for the year. So I rode in the back of the convertible waving, and we practiced at home. And my daughters told me to go like this. But when I see somebody I know, I'd say, hey, Connie, because that's the way I was raised. I waved at everybody on the route. In 1978, because of my experience with Nathaniel Lee and realizing how much he needed something, it was a hopeless case, but I decided that God wanted me to go to jail. It took me 15 years to finally get around to it because I was teaching and raising kids and being a gopher for my husband. He'd call and say, run to Orlando and get so-and-so. So I was busy. In 1978, I started to go to the Volusia County Correctional Institute with Betty Hutchings and Mary Brothers. And I feel like that's what God has called me to do. I've been going 37 years now. Every Monday night, I see people whose lives are ruined every week. Some of them I've known for 20 years or more. Most of them, after 10 years, you don't see them anymore because they're dead. They die early from drug overdose and from prostitution, disease, and murder. Once in a while, one of them comes up to me on the street or in a restaurant and says, Mary, I know you from jail. They say it real loud, you know. And I said, oh, I remember you. Well, I've got my job. I've got my car. I've got my kids back. Thank you for coming to jail. That's the reward for 37 years, to know that somebody's life was changed. One of the articles that I wrote recently was about a black woman who was an inmate, and she was on parole and her mother died. She was a crack addict. And she went to her mother's casket and said, "Mother, you wanted me to quit taking dope. I promise you, I'll never take it again." So she turned herself in because she was on parole, served her time out of Volusia County Jail, and the judge let her go. She went straight to the church, and she's been there ever since. She's very active in her church, and she depends on God to keep her life straight. She was there last night, last night, big jail. And her testimony outdoes anything that any of the rest of us can do, because she's clean for 10 years when she comes to jail with us. It's a wonderful thing. I had taught Sunday school since 1953. When I came to DeLand First Baptist Church, I started teaching. And I sung in the choir since 1939 when I was 12 years old. I was 6 inches taller than all the kids my age because I grew up faster. At my church, Stetson Baptist Church, I served as chairman of the Building and Grounds Committee for 35 years because I knew a lot about construction because my husband was in construction. I had an exercise class at the church I just stopped last October for 36 years that I taught. One of my friends says, "Mary, we need to exercise. You can teach it." I said, "I never taught exercise." She said, "Well, you can do it." So we did. 1, 2, 3, 4. I think I'll be counting in heaven. I counted so many times on it in the exercise class. The other thing that I've done recently is a soup ministry. When somebody in my church or some friend is sick with the flu, feeling terrible, I make a big pot of chicken soup, put it in a jar, and go to their house. And if they're real sick, I just put it on the doorstep, ring the bell, and I don't go in because I don't want the flu. But it's been very productive. It's helped people. I tell them it's magic. And I do make good soup. I'm not much of a cook, but I can make good soup, so that's worked out well. Is there anything else that you would like to ask me or like for me to talk about? I'll be glad to.
I would like your daughters to ask you a few questions off camera, but we'll be able to hear their questions. Is there anything, Kathy or Connie, that you would like to ask your mom or tell her at this time?
I would like to know about your cancer.
Cancer?
You didn't mention that, yeah.
In 1981, I had breast cancer. And they chose to give me radiation. For 17 years, I was cancer-free. In 2007, it came back. And I had a mastectomy. So I've got 8 years on it now. I'm doing well. And I'm pleased that God spared me. I think He has a purpose for me living. That's what I'm doing, trying to live for Him.
And how many years have you lived on this earth?
88.
88.
I was born in 1927. And 2 days after I was born, Lindbergh flew across the ocean. I used to tell my kids I saw his plane go over going to Europe for the first time.
What kind of changes have you seen in DeLand since you've been here?
When we first came here, it flooded that year. There was a lady that was on the hospital board, and she gave all the nurses a key to her property out on Lake Lindley. And every day it was hot, and I think we didn't have air conditioning in the hospital. And every day I think, oh, I'm going swimming. Every day at 3 o'clock, it rained. It rained, and it rained, and it rained. I thought DeLand was the wettest place I'd ever seen. The bridge, White Hair Bridge, was underwater. People were fishing off the bridge. The road to Daytona was underwater. Down at Sanford, that highway, 1792, was underwater. It was really a flood that year. That hasn't happened since. And they did build a new bridge, which is higher in case it ever happens again. But, let's see. One of the main changes that I noticed is Victoria Park. My husband, Fred Waller, knew Volusia County like the back of his hand. He used to say, my ambition is to fill Volusia County full of holes. So he dug swimming pools. And now, if he were to come back here, he wouldn't know where he was if I took him out to Victoria Park. That's all new. That orange camp was a clay road when we moved out there. And now that's a big change. There's a lot of wonderful people who moved into the land there. The Athens Theater, it was up when we came here, had an organ. You know, the organist sat up and played. And there was a Drika Theater. We used to go there, and the man that put the reels on the movie would go to sleep. So when the second reel came due, we'd have to holler and say, wake up! Put the second reel on so we could see the rest of the movie. I'm thinking, well, Stetson certainly has changed. They've built so many new buildings since I graduated from there. I still go there 3 times a week for exercise at Hollis Center. They have a wonderful exercise department. It's got 50 machines in it. So. And as an alumni, I have a ticket. I can go to some of the ball games, to the theater, to all the concerts, use the swimming pool, and use the library where my daughter Kathy works. Because of that, I have to pay for it. It's $150 a year, but my daughter uses it. I can take 4 people. The people that come in the winter use that. It's a real blessing to me.
So how many family members do you have now? Your 2 daughters, do you have grandchildren?
Yes, each of my daughters has a daughter, so. And Kathy's daughter, my granddaughter Carol, has a daughter named Brittany. And about 2 weeks ago, we went to Alabama, where Brittany lives, saw her graduate with high honors from her high school. And then, that was on Thursday night, no, Saturday she got married. So now she's in Kansas. She's married to a serviceman. That's one of the things I wanted to mention. My family has a proud history of serving the country. The Revolutionary War, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather was in that war. In the Civil War, my great-grandfather lost a leg. He came home, had a wooden leg. One of my cousins says she remembered sitting on his lap and putting her finger in the hole in his wooden leg. He came home, had 13 children. That man's name was Howell. That was my mother's name. And then in the Korean War, that Fred Waller served in that. World War II, Joe Carlton and all that family, and my 3 brothers all served World War II. Hitler was trying to take over the world. That really affected us. And my younger brother was in the Army, in the Medical Corps in Vietnam. And I have a great nephew who served in Iraq, so they pretty well covered the whole wars. My father was in World War I. He was in Europe 3 years, in France, and he came home and bought a car, started carrying the mail, which he did before. He was a rural mail carrier, and married my mother in 3 days. Hadn't seen her in 3 years. So.
It was the right thing to do.
Oh, yeah.
Mary, you have a lot of memorabilia you brought here with you today. Would you like to show us some of that and tell us what it is?
This is my nurse's cap. I had to earn that. You don't just walk in and get a cap.
I bet.
When you're a senior, you get a black band on your cap. So that signifies that you're getting there. Yeah. This is the armband that I wore during the war as a plane observer. And this is the flag that my mother had in her window for my two older brothers during World War II. If your child was killed, then the stars were gold. She didn't lose her children. She was blessed. This little pin, I don't know if you can see this or not, but it's got a swastika on it. And it was sent to me by one of the boys I was telling you about, I used to get letters from. He said he was in Germany, and this pin was given to the mothers who had 10 Aryan children by Hitler. It was an award, and I've kept it all these years, since 1945. And this is a picture of Joe Carlton, my first husband. Good-looking fellow.
Yes, very good
Worked
looking.
in Duval Jewelry Company. And this is the headlines when he was murdered. We lived down on South Florida Avenue. The people of the land were so good to Kathy and me. They had little jars all over town that said Joe Carlton Fund, and people put money in, had enough money to pay the hospital bill, $3,000. That was a lot of money in those days. And I was so thankful and blessed. One lady made a dress for me and one for Kathy by hand, every stitch, just alike. She was 2 and I was 30. And one of the furniture companies gave me a new bed because the bed was blood-soaked. This is a headline I thought was interesting.
Very interesting.
Big news.
In those days, there was no television and you didn't have instant communication, so the newspapers and the radio is our major way of learning what was going on in the world.
Yeah. We would go to the movies and see the newsreels, but by then it was 2 or 3 weeks old. This is the book that my daughter and I compiled with the articles that I've written. I was going to show you a picture of my grandfather that lost his leg. My brother, Hugh Dorset, they lived here in the land. This is a picture of me and my 3 brothers. The younger one's still living. He's 82. His name is Herb Dorset. He was named after President Roosevelt and President Hoover, Herbert Franklin Roosevelt. It was a popular thing to do back in those days. There's my grandfather that was the captain of the ship. That's the Belle of the Suwannee. It was a kind of a tourist ship. It sailed out of the Suwannee River to New Orleans and down to Key West and back. And when they would get near to shore, he'd pull the horn and go, whoo, and the people would gather on shore to see the ship go by. And the black people would stack wood there for him to burn on his ship, so that it was a steamship, you know, had to have fuel. And my grandmother would hear the horn, and she'd grab up some food, some home-cooked food, and take it down to the river so her husband could have a home-cooked meal. My grandfather died in 1900. The ship went aground on Hog Island off of Steenhatchee down Cedar Key, and he dived down. It was at Christmas time. He dived down to try to retrieve some of the brass off of the boat, and he got pneumonia and died. There were no antibiotics in those days. Pneumonia was a death sentence. So the ship Belle, the Belle of the Suwannee, was brought to shore and put on a brand new ship called the city of Hawkinsville, Georgia. So the Belle of the Suwannee River was on that, the city of Hawkinsville.
Mary, based on your experience, and you certainly have had a rich life, what advice would you give a young person today, somebody like your granddaughter, 18, 19, 20-year-old person, or great-granddaughter?
I don't travel very much. They got minds of their own, my two daughters. And I must say that they're my proudest achievement. I have two independent girls. They never call me and say, "Mama, I got a flat tire." They never call me and say, "I need some money." Never. They take care of themselves. Connie's a masseuse here in town. Her name is Summer Moore. And Kathy works in the library at Stutz in the DuPont Ball Library. I'm very proud of them.
I can tell that you are. How would you like to be remembered?
My
your
goal is to live like Jesus lived when he was here on earth. He went about doing good. And he gave us some rules to go by, and I try to live by those rules. That's the reason I go to jail. You know, Jesus said, "I was hungry, and I was thirsty, and I was naked, and I was sick, and I was in prison, and you came to me." And the apostle said, "When were you in jail?" And he said, "When you do it for the least of these, you do it for me." So that's why I go to prison.
Tell what's on your gravestone.
Oh, I got my tombstone because I always wanted a pink marble tombstone, so I went and got it. And I have all the information on it. It says, "Daughter of Alfred and Georgia Howell Dorset, 1927, and there's a blank. Soon that'll be filled. Kathy knows who to call. Get it carved in there. And then at the bottom it says, "She did what she could." That's on my grandmother's tombstone, and I wanted it on mine. See, if you think ahead, you can have whatever you want on it.
Well, it's been delightful having you come here to the DeLand House today and do this interview for us, and I hope that you and your family will enjoy watching it for many years to come. Thank you.
I appreciate being asked. I feel honored.
Oh, well, it's our honor to have you here. Thank you so much. And thank you to Summer and to Kathy for being here with us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.